Imagine a palace where the grand corridors echo not only with the footsteps of kings, but also with whispers of the women who walked in their shadows. Picture portraits hanging on gilded walls, kings and emperors staring back at us with authority, queens dressed in their royal splendor. Yet somewhere beyond those familiar faces, hidden in the folds of history, are sisters, royal sisters, whose stories are rarely told. They were born into crowns they could not wear, into dynasties that often valued them as pawns in political games. But behind the silks and jewels, behind the marriages arranged in candlelit halls, many of these sisters were architects of influence, rebels in disguise, and guardians of cultures we still celebrate today. For centuries, the spotlight has rested on the reigning monarchs. We learn of Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, Louis XIV, and Catherine the Great. Their names dominate our textbooks, their actions shaping the world as we know it. But what if I told you that their sisters, often dismissed as mere background figures, played roles just as dramatic and world-changing? Some negotiated peace when wars threatened to rip empires apart. Others quietly funded universities, commissioned architectural wonders, or supported scientific discoveries that lit the path toward progress. A few dared to resist the heavy weight of duty, defying their families and risking everything to follow their own convictions. Think of Sophia Alekseyevna, the sister who ruled Russia in the shadows before Peter the Great could claim his throne. Or Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's sister, whose defiance altered the expectations placed upon royal women forever. Consider Jahanara Begum, the Mughal princess whose passion for architecture still defines parts of Delhi today, or Marguerite of Valois, who dared to take her pen and write her own truth when the world preferred her silence. These sisters were not passive observers. They shaped alliances, swayed policies, nurtured culture, and in some cases even secured the survival of their dynasties. And yet, when we speak of history, their names slip quietly into the background. Their actions are footnotes, overshadowed by the kings and queens who stood at the center stage. Why? Perhaps because their power was often invisible, expressed not through thrones or crowns but through counsel, influence, and rebellion. Perhaps because history has long preferred a neat story of kings conquering and queens ruling, leaving little space for the sisters who made subtle but seismic changes. But their echoes remain, waiting to be heard again. This is the story of the royal sisters whose impact stretched far beyond their titles. A hidden world of influence, rebellion, and legacy lies just beyond the kings and queens we already know. And today, we are going to open those hidden archives together. Welcome to our channel Words of Time. And in this video, we will uncover the forgotten world of royal sisters, exploring how their actions shaped empires, safeguarded culture, and left enduring echoes that still reach us today. When we think about royalty, the stories that usually come to mind are those of kings and queens. Their faces appear in portraits, their names are attached to great battles, treaties, and dynasties, and their lives are told and retold in history books, films, and television dramas. But just beyond those familiar figures lies another set of lives, often overlooked and yet deeply tied to the same currents of power and change. These are the sisters of monarchs, the women whose names might appear only in footnotes or genealogical charts, but whose influence and choices shaped the course of empires in ways that were subtle, hidden, or deliberately ignored. They were rarely seen at the front of the stage, but they were present in every turn of courtly life, family politics, and diplomatic maneuvering. To open the archives of their stories is to uncover another dimension of history, one in which the quiet corridors of palaces tell tales just as dramatic as the throne rooms. The idea of sisters in royal families immediately complicates the common picture of monarchy. A king's sister might become the spouse of a foreign ruler, sent away to seal an alliance through marriage. She might also remain in the same court, moving within the delicate sphere of influence where family ties and political needs collided. Sometimes she was kept in the background, carefully shielded from scandal, but at other times she was trusted with extraordinary tasks that required tact, intelligence, and resilience. The very fact of being a sister meant living both inside and outside power. She was of the bloodline but not usually the heir, close to authority but often denied formal recognition of her part in it. This tension gave her a unique position, and the choices she made often rippled out far beyond her personal life. When we look closely at the great turning points in European, Asian, and Middle Eastern history, we begin to see the faint but undeniable presence of these women. They were not pawns, though they were often treated as such by male relatives who arranged their marriages or managed their dowries. Instead, many found ways to use their positions to advance causes, protect their families, and even steer political outcomes. To call them powerless is to misunderstand the ways influence worked at court. Power was not always about commanding armies or signing decrees. It was often about persuasion, access, networks, and the ability to shape perceptions. Royal sisters had all these tools at their disposal, even if they did not always use them openly. Consider the role of marriage. For centuries, a sister of a king or queen was a bargaining chip in the great game of diplomacy. To marry her off to another royal house was to tie two dynasties together, ideally preventing conflict or securing trade. But these marriages were not simple transactions. Once a sister entered her new home, she became a bridge between courts. She wrote letters, carried messages, and sometimes served as the most trusted channel of information between two monarchs who happened to be brothers-in-law. A peace treaty might be signed by men, but it was often maintained by the ongoing relationship of women who shared bloodlines across borders. A sister placed in such a role had to learn to navigate not just her own household, but also the expectations of her birth family, and the suspicions of her new one. It is important to remember that these women lived in environments that were intensely scrutinized. Court life was not private in the modern sense. Every gesture, every rumor, every friendship could be read as a signal of political meaning. Sisters often had to perform a balancing act, presenting themselves as loyal to their natal family, while proving their loyalty to their new one. Some succeeded brilliantly, earning respect and affection in both courts, while others became caught in webs of distrust. But even failure or scandal could leave a mark on history, creating ruptures between nations or fueling rivalries that changed the course of events. Beyond marriage, sisters also had important roles within their original courts. They could become confidants of ruling brothers, sources of advice when trust in ministers faltered. They were often educated alongside their siblings, sharing tutors and exposure to the same intellectual influences. Their insights could be sharp, their observations valuable. Letters that survive from some of these sisters reveal a keen awareness of politics, a grasp of strategy, and a willingness to speak candidly when others might not. Of course, the historical record is incomplete, and much of what they said and did was never written down. But what does survive suggests that their brothers sometimes leaned on them more than official documents reveal. Sisters were also visible symbols of dynastic continuity. In times of instability, when a throne was contested or a dynasty under threat, the presence of sisters could either stabilize or destabilize matters. A beloved sister who married into a rival house might be seen as a potential ally, while an unpopular one could be cast as a traitor. In extreme cases, sisters became pawns in succession disputes, either used to bolster claims or accused of conspiring against rightful heirs. Their safety was never fully secure. To be close to power was to be vulnerable to the shifting winds of politics. Yet this very vulnerability made some of them masters of survival, learning how to read a room, judge loyalties, and act with discretion. It was not the kind of authority that could be displayed on a battlefield, but it was real nonetheless. In many cultures, sisters were also patrons of religion, art, and charity. Since their movements were restricted and their political roles constrained, they often expressed influence through cultural and spiritual channels. A convent, a school, or a hospital might bear the mark of their patronage. The artistic circles they encouraged could shape taste across a whole generation. In these ways, they left legacies that were both visible and enduring, even if not immediately tied to politics. We might underestimate how much soft power was exercised through these channels. While a king might leave behind a fortress or a treaty, his sister might leave behind a tradition of music, learning, or worship that continued long after the throne changed hands. It is striking to see how often these sisters appear when one digs beneath the surface of historical accounts. They are there in letters, in the margins of chronicles, in portraits that capture their likeness but not their stories. They are often remembered only in relation to the men around them. The sister of this king, the wife of that ruler, the mother of some prince. But to define them only this way is to miss the larger picture. They were actors in their own right, and their decisions, whether made in private or in public, shaped outcomes that historians later credited to others. Opening the hidden archives of their lives is not simply an exercise in filling out family trees. It is an act of restoring agency to those who had it, even if they were denied official recognition. We should not romanticize all these sisters as heroines or visionaries. Some were deeply flawed, complicit in cruelty or blind to the suffering of subjects. Some embraced luxury and avoided responsibility, living out lives of self-indulgence. To pretend otherwise would be to create another myth. But what is important is that they had choices, even within limits, and those choices mattered. To recognize them as players rather than pawns is to admit that history is rarely the work of only those whose names are written in large letters. It is the work of networks, relationships, and influences that move through families as much as through armies. The silence that often surrounds these sisters is not accidental. History has long been written with a focus on formal power, on titles and offices, and on the assumption that women without thrones had little to contribute. But the evidence, when we bother to look, contradicts this. The hidden archives show that sisters were present at the heart of decision-making, sometimes openly, sometimes quietly, but always in ways that shape the stories we think we already know. To learn their stories is not to rewrite history entirely, but to deepen it. It is to recognize that beyond the kings and queens, another layer of actors lived and influenced events. Without them, the story is incomplete. The fascination of studying royal sisters lies in how they force us to see power differently. They remind us that influence can be exercised without formal authority, that survival can itself be a form of victory, and that personal relationships can have as much impact on history as battles or laws. They were not simply background figures in the lives of great rulers. They were sisters, and that role, so ordinary in human terms, so extraordinary in royal ones, gave them a vantage point that shaped the destinies of nations. When we move deeper into the hidden lives of royal sisters, the image becomes even more striking. These women were not only figures at the edges of courts, quietly influencing family dynamics. They were at times the very architects of alliances that reshaped continents and the catalysts for conflicts that redrew maps. They lived in an era when marriage was one of the strongest tools of diplomacy, and as sisters, they were often the ones deployed to cement bonds between dynasties. Unlike treaties written on parchment, their presence in foreign courts had lasting consequences, for they carried with them not only a name and a dowry, but a network of loyalties and expectations. In this sense, they were human treaties, binding rulers together in ways that could either stabilize or destabilize empires. The daughters of Maria Theresa of Austria. Maria Theresa herself was an extraordinary ruler, but her legacy was not only her reign, it was also the web of daughters she sent across Europe. Each one became a living strand in a complex tapestry of power, carrying with her both the prestige of the Habsburg dynasty and the expectations of her mother's political vision. One daughter, Maria Carolina, married into the Neapolitan court, and through her influence became a central figure in the politics of southern Italy, resisting French expansion with remarkable determination. Another, Maria Amalia, married the Duke of Parma and became embroiled in Italian politics, her decisions influencing not only her duchy but the shifting alliances of neighboring powers. Perhaps the most famous, Maria Antonia, better known as Marie Antoinette, became the Queen of France, her presence symbolizing a bond between Austria and France that was supposed to keep the balance of Europe intact. The failure of that marriage to deliver stability, culminating in revolution, shows how risky such strategies could be. Yet whether the alliances succeeded or collapsed, these daughters, as sisters, were pivotal in shaping the fates of kingdoms. It is easy to dismiss these marriages as mere moves in a diplomatic game, but the reality was far more complicated. These women were not just passive figures handed from one court to another. They had to live the consequences of these alliances every day, shaping relationships with husbands, in-laws, and ministers. They were watched closely for signs of loyalty or betrayal, and their words could carry the weight of policy. Maria Theresa's letters to her daughters reveal how she expected them to act not only as wives, but as her agents abroad. She instructed them, advised them, and sometimes scolded them, expecting that through their behavior and choices they could advance Habsburg interests. In this sense, Maria Theresa's daughters were not simply married off, They were deployed as instruments of policy, each one a living embodiment of Austria's reach. They were sisters to one another, scattered across Europe, yet still bound by their mother's vision. Together, they created a network that shaped European politics for decades, for better and for worse. This same pattern, though less often remembered, appears in the case of Catherine the Great's sisters. Catherine herself, as Empress of Russia, has been celebrated as a towering figure of 18th-century politics. Yet behind her, the quieter stories of her sisters reveal another layer of influence. Catherine was born Sophia von Holtz-Zerbst, a minor German princess whose family was thrust into prominence by her marriage to the future Tsar. Her sisters, though less famous, also played roles in the broader game of diplomacy. One of them, Johanna Elizabeth, maneuvered within the complex German courts, positioning herself and her children within advantageous networks. Another, Augusta, married into the Holstein family, linking German houses that would later matter in the dynastic struggles of Northern Europe. These alliances may seem less dramatic than Catherine's rise, but they formed part of the background of relationships that allowed her to secure her own throne and maintain her influence. In Catherine's story, we see not only the extraordinary ambition of one sister, but also the quieter groundwork laid by her siblings, who ensured that their family's reach extended far beyond their modest origins. The sisters of monarchs were not only architects of peace, but sometimes catalysts of war. An alliance sealed by marriage could become a source of tension if loyalties were questioned. Marie Antoinette, for instance, was often accused in France of favoring Austrian interests, a suspicion that contributed to her unpopularity. Her mere presence became a political problem, inflaming nationalist resentments and feeding revolutionary rhetoric. Similarly, other royal sisters found themselves caught in the crossfire of conflicting expectations. A sister married into a rival court might be accused of spying, of conspiring, or of betraying her birth family. In some cases, these accusations were true, for sisters did serve as channels of secret communication. In other cases, the charges were fabrications, but the damage was the same. Wars have been justified by claims of betrayal, and sisters have been used as scapegoats when alliances soured. The deeper we look, the more we see how royal sisters were central to the logic of dynastic politics. They remind us that diplomacy was not just about treaties signed in council chambers, but about relationships lived out in palaces and households. The presence of a sister in a foreign court could soften tensions or sharpen them, depending on how she navigated her role. She was both a representative of her natal family and a member of a new one, always straddling a line that could never be perfectly balanced. That precarious position gave her power, for everyone wanted her loyalty, but it also exposed her to suspicion, for no one fully trusted her. This duality made sisters both invaluable and dangerous, both architects of alliances and potential sparks of war. What makes their stories so compelling is the human dimension behind these high politics. To read the letters of Maria Theresa to her daughters, or the accounts of Catherine the Great's family, is to glimpse women caught between duty and desire, personal longing and public expectation. A sister might long for affection in her marriage, but know she was expected to prioritize her family's political interests. She might wish to shield her children from conflict, but find them dragged into the struggles of empire. These were not abstract roles. They were lived experiences full of tension, sacrifice, and resilience. Their influence on history came not only from formal acts but from the way they managed these tensions day after day, shaping the tone of courts and the direction of policies in ways that are not always visible in chronicles, but can be felt in outcomes. If we step back and look at the broader pattern, a striking picture emerges. Sisters were part of a system that relied on them to carry the weight of alliances across borders. Their lives show us that power is not only a matter of who sits on the throne but of who lives in the surrounding rooms, who shares the bloodline, and who carries the family's name into new lands. They remind us that history is not only made by kings who give orders or generals who fight battles. It is also made by sisters who write letters, manage households, raise heirs, and navigate the fraught terrain between loyalty and suspicion. They were not pawns, though they were often treated as such. They were players whose moves could alter the balance of power in Europe and beyond. To understand the full story of alliances and wars, we must keep these women in view. The daughters of Maria Theresa, scattered across Europe, show how sisters could form a living web of diplomacy that both sustained and unraveled empires. The sisters of Catherine the Great remind us that even those overshadowed by a dominant sibling could shape the context in which greatness was achieved. And the countless other sisters, whose names we might never learn, remind us that behind every throne was a family, and within that family, sisters who carried burdens, exercised influence, and left marks on history that deserve to be seen. To open their archives is not only to honor forgotten women, but to tell a more complete story of how the world we live in was shaped. Through alliances crafted in love and duty, and through wars sparked by suspicion and betrayal, it becomes clear that their roles were not limited to being passive participants in dynastic arrangements. Some of them were not only symbols of treaties or figures of suspicion, but active agents who worked, sometimes in secret, to instigate conflict or prevent it. The hidden stories of these women reveal how diplomacy could unfold in quiet conversations, in letters sent across borders, or in subtle acts of persuasion that never appeared in official records. Their influence was often exercised not on the battlefield or in council chambers, but in the private spaces of family life and courtly ritual, where decisions of enormous consequence were first shaped. One of the clearest examples of sisters maneuvering behind the scenes can be found in the late 18th century with Maria Carolina of Naples, one of Maria Theresa's many daughters. Married into the Neapolitan court, she quickly developed a strong sense of independence, and became deeply suspicious of French ambitions after watching the fate of her sister Marie Antoinette. Rather than accept her role as a symbolic link between Austria and Naples, Maria Carolina built a network of advisors and foreign contacts that made her a political actor in her own right. She actively encouraged Naples to resist French influence, urging her husband to align with British and Austrian powers. Through her determination, Naples became an active player in the wars against revolutionary France. In this case, a royal sister did not merely uphold the terms of an alliance, but pushed her court into conflict. Her personal feelings about her sister's execution sharpened her political stance, showing how the private grief of a sibling could spill into the realm of international war. Yet the opposite was also true. Some sisters acted deliberately to prevent bloodshed, using their family ties as a form of quiet diplomacy. When disputes flared between dynasties, sisters who found themselves in foreign courts often became unofficial mediators. Letters between them could ease tensions in ways that formal envoys could not. A king might distrust the words of a minister, but he might pause before ignoring the plea of his sister, who wrote not in the language of treaties, but in the language of family bonds. These exchanges could humanize conflicts, reminding rulers that behind the banners of armies were shared families and common blood. Although historians rarely record these interventions, scattered letters reveal moments where a carefully worded message from a sister helped cool tempers that might otherwise have escalated into open war. In Russia, the role of royal sisters in shaping conflict is seen in the circle surrounding Catherine the Great. Catherine herself was a master strategist, but her extended family also participated in the web of intrigue that defined Russian politics. Her sisters, though less powerful individually, maintained correspondence across German courts, carrying information that Catherine could use to anticipate alliances or hostilities. Even if they were not commanding armies, they helped to shape the ground on which conflicts were fought. Some encouraged Catherine to pursue bold policies of expansion, while others counseled caution, urging her to balance ambition with prudence. Their influence is harder to trace, because it came in private words rather than public acts, but it formed part of the decision-making process that allowed Catherine to build and sustain her empire. Royal sisters could also become lightning rods for conflict when their loyalties were questioned. Suspicion that a sister was favoring her birth family could spark unrest in her new homeland. Marie Antoinette offers the most famous example, accused throughout her life in France of secretly working for Austrian interests. Whether or not she actually acted as a spy, the perception was enough to inflame public opinion. Pamphlets and rumors painted her as a traitor, and this image helped fuel revolutionary anger. In this sense, even without actively instigating war, a sister could become a symbol that pushed a population toward conflict. Her presence, her words, and her gestures were scrutinized, and the interpretation of them could have deadly results. Other sisters, however, turned such suspicions into opportunities to broker peace. When tensions rose between courts, they sometimes positioned themselves as bridges rather than barriers. A clever sister might encourage both sides to view her as a trusted channel, reminding each of her loyalty and affection. Through this delicate balance, she could delay or even prevent conflicts. It was never a guarantee, but the attempt itself demonstrates how sisters consciously engaged in politics, aware of their precarious position and determined to use it constructively. The Tudor princesses of England offer a telling example of this dynamic. Mary Tudor, sister of Henry VIII, married into the French court as part of a carefully designed alliance. Though her marriage was short, her presence was intended to keep peace between England and France. Later, her letters to her brother showed her awareness of the fragile balance of power and her attempts to keep him from rash action. In this sense, she acted as a quiet check on his notorious impulsiveness, though not always successfully. The mere fact that she tried illustrates how sisters could engage in diplomacy not by issuing commands, but by appealing to familial trust. The Mughal Empire in India offers another perspective. There, sisters of emperors often played powerful roles in the palace, acting as intermediaries between factions and helping to shape decisions of war and peace. Jahanara Begum, sister of Emperor Aurangzeb, is remembered for her influence in court politics. She was deeply respected and often acted as a mediator between rival factions within the empire. Her voice carried enough weight that she could calm disputes that might otherwise have escalated into violence. Her ability to maintain peace within the court helped prevent internal divisions from tearing the empire apart at critical moments. In this way, she demonstrates that sisters were not merely participants in arranged marriages abroad, but also key figures within their own dynasties, safeguarding stability from within. What all these stories reveal is that sisters could act with intention, and their choices mattered. Some pressed for war, driven by anger, grief, or ambition. Others worked tirelessly to avert conflict, appealing to bonds of blood, or to ideals of mercy and restraint. Their influence was not always decisive, and history does not always record it clearly. Yet the evidence we do have shows that they were conscious actors, aware of the stakes and deliberate in their efforts. They were not passive vessels of dynastic politics but participants who could tilt events one way or another. Looking at these women reminds us that history is not only the story of rulers who signed treaties or generals who won battles. It is also the story of sisters who whispered warnings, who urged caution, who stoked anger, or who begged for restraint. They lived in the shadows of thrones, but from those shadows they could cast long lines across the map of history. They were architects of alliances, certainly, but also guardians or destroyers of peace. Their lives, lived in private yet deeply entangled with public affairs, shaped the fate of nations in ways that deserve to be remembered. As we move from the sphere of war and diplomacy into the quieter, but equally enduring realm of culture, we find another layer of the story of royal sisters. They were not only architects of alliances and players in the great games of peace and conflict, but also guardians of cultural identity, champions of learning, and patrons whose choices left marks on the landscapes of their nations. While their brothers often spent resources on wars, fortresses, and dynastic claims, many sisters poured their influence and wealth into projects that nourished the arts, sciences, and education. Through them, the heritage of nations was preserved, new traditions were born, and the cultural fabric of entire societies was strengthened. In their patronage, we can see how royal sisters safeguarded legacies that outlasted the shifting borders of empires. One striking example comes from the Habsburg world. Empress Elizabeth of Austria, better known as Sisi, had a sister named Sophie of Bavaria. Though far less celebrated in literature and art than Elizabeth herself, Sophie carried her own legacy as a protector of culture and tradition. Coming from the Bavarian court, where appreciation for scholarship and music was deeply ingrained, she brought with her a devotion to the arts that influenced not only the circles she inhabited, but also the broader European understanding of refinement. While Elizabeth became an emblem of romantic melancholy, Sophie took a more practical approach, supporting artistic projects that kept alive the heritage of her lineage. Sisters like Sophie remind us that even when overshadowed by more flamboyant siblings, their quiet acts of patronage could shape the aesthetic life of courts for generations. Patronage of the arts was not an afterthought for royal sisters. It was often the arena in which they could exercise power most freely. Political roles were limited, but cultural influence was expansive. A sister could sponsor a poet, commission a painter, or establish a salon where ideas flourished. In these spaces, power was not about issuing decrees but about nurturing creativity. The presence of such patrons often determined whether artists could survive, whether scientists could pursue their research, and whether educational institutions could continue their work. For every famous name in art and learning, there often stood a sister who believed in their vision and provided the support they needed to thrive. The architectural legacy of royal sisters is especially visible. Across Europe and Asia, palaces, convents, gardens, and academies bear the imprint of their tastes and ambitions. Consider Isabella Clara Eugenia, the daughter of Philip II of Spain, and sister to several powerful princes. When she governed the Spanish Netherlands, she and her husband, Archduke Albert, became patrons of monumental architecture. Their projects preserved Gothic cathedrals, supported Baroque artistry, and reinforced the cultural identity of the region at a time of great political upheaval. Though remembered as a ruler in her own right, Isabella's role as a sister also shaped her vision. She saw herself as a custodian of her father's legacy and of the Catholic tradition. Through her patronage, the identity of the Low Countries was strengthened, and their artistic heritage blossomed in ways that still define the cities of Brussels, Antwerp, and Ghent. In Russia, the tradition of imperial sisters as cultural guardians also left an indelible mark. Catherine the Great is often credited with making St. Petersburg a cultural capital, but she did not act alone. Her extended family, including her sisters and nieces, encouraged architectural projects that gave the city its distinctive blend of Russian tradition and European elegance. Palaces and academies flourished not only through Catherine's vision, but also through the interests of her female relatives, who hosted salons, brought foreign architects into favor, and ensured that cultural projects remained central to the identity of the Russian court. Even when their names did not appear on official documents, their influence shaped the tastes of the empire, blending the old with the new. The Mughal world offers another fascinating case. Jahanara Begum, the sister of Emperor Aurangzeb, was not only a political mediator, but also a renowned patron of architecture and learning. She played a central role in designing gardens, supporting mosques, and funding cultural projects that continue to define Indian heritage. One of her most lasting contributions was her involvement in the development of Delhi, where her patronage left behind architectural wonders that blended spirituality with artistry. Her deep interest in Sufi traditions also ensured that religious and cultural heritage was preserved in ways that transcended dynastic politics. In her story, we see how a sister could become a guardian not only of political stability, but of cultural continuity, leaving behind spaces that still inspire awe centuries later. What makes these stories remarkable is the way personal interest shaped public legacy. Sisters often supported what they loved. If they had a passion for music, orchestras and composers benefited. If they were fascinated by science, they funded laboratories and experiments. If they adored literature, libraries expanded and poets thrived. These personal interests, filtered through their positions of privilege, became national treasures. The heritage we associate with entire nations often grew out of the individual tastes of royal sisters who saw in the arts and sciences both a refuge from the burdens of their roles and a means to leave behind something lasting. They may not have commanded armies, but they built monuments of culture that stood longer than fortresses. The role of education in their patronage is another key dimension. In societies where access to learning was limited, sisters who championed education opened doors for future generations. Some established schools for women, recognizing that their own limited opportunities could be widened for others. In Italy, for instance, noble sisters of ruling houses often sponsored convent schools that became centers of female education, teaching not only religious devotion but also languages, literature, and sometimes even science. These schools allowed knowledge to pass through generations, planting seeds that would blossom long after the dynasties that funded them faded. In this sense, royal sisters were pioneers in expanding education beyond narrow confines, a contribution that shaped the intellectual life of Europe in ways that are not always fully appreciated. Even in courts where women were expected to remain in the background, sisters found ways to assert themselves through cultural guardianship. In the Ottoman Empire, sisters of sultans often resided in the harem, where they wielded influence not through public office but through patronage. They funded mosques, markets, and baths, many of which still stand in Istanbul today. These projects were not only acts of piety, but also symbols of cultural pride and continuity. The architecture they supported became part of the living heritage of the city, reminding us that even when confined physically, their vision stretched across urban landscapes and into the daily lives of people. Through their patronage, they shaped the identity of the empire as much as their ruling brothers did, though in ways that were less visible in political chronicles. It is important to recognize that this cultural legacy was not accidental. Sisters understood that their ability to act in political or military spheres was limited, but they also knew that patronage gave them enduring power. A building once constructed, a school once founded, a manuscript once commissioned. All these lasted beyond lifetimes, beyond wars, beyond the rise and fall of dynasties. In this way, they secured a kind of immortality, ensuring that their names would live on even when their brothers' battles were forgotten. The fact that we still walk through palaces, gardens, and streets shaped by their vision is testimony to their foresight. Of course, their roles were not always entirely altruistic. Patronage also served to reinforce their prestige, to showcase their refinement, and to secure their place in history. But even when motivated by vanity, the results often benefited wider society. A sister who wished to display her taste by building a magnificent palace ended up providing a cultural landmark for her nation. One who wanted her salon to be the most talked about gathering in Europe ended up nurturing intellectual currents that shaped the Enlightenment. Their ambitions, personal or otherwise, produced public goods, and it is in this paradox that much of their importance lies. The cultural role of sisters also reflected the delicate balance they had to maintain between public expectation and private identity. Many found in the arts a safe space to express themselves, to carve out individuality in lives otherwise controlled by duty. Their interest in poetry, painting, or architecture was not only about patronage, but also about self-definition. Through cultural projects, they could leave behind something that reflected who they were beyond titles of wife, mother, or sister. In this sense, their guardianship of culture was also a form of personal liberation, a way of ensuring that their voices echoed across time even if history books did not record their speeches. Looking across continents and centuries, from Sophia of Bavaria in the Austrian sphere to Jahanara Begum in Mughal India, from Isabella Clara Eugenia in the Low Countries to Ottoman princesses in Istanbul, a common pattern emerges. Sisters embraced the arts, sciences, and education not as hobbies, but as avenues of power. They shaped landscapes, preserved traditions, and seeded new ideas. In their patronage, we see the foundations of modern cultural identity. Nations remember themselves through monuments, schools, and works of art. And many of these owe their existence to the vision and determination of sisters whose names deserve to be remembered alongside kings and queens. The legacy they left are not one of battles won or treaties signed but of beauty, learning, and heritage. When we walk through a cathedral, read a manuscript, or admire a painting that survived centuries, we are often walking in the footsteps of a sister who, behind the scenes, ensured its survival. Their role as guardians of culture completes the picture of royal sisters as not only actors in politics and diplomacy, but as architects of memory itself. Through them, history becomes more than the story of power. It becomes the story of identity, meaning, and continuity, a story written not only in blood and borders but in stone, song, and knowledge. When we look at the cultural achievements of royal sisters, it becomes clear that their patronage was not only about beauty, faith, or memory. It was also another expression of their capacity to shape power quietly, even when the political world tried to exclude them. For every sister who left behind a palace, a school, or a poem, there were others who turned their attention directly to the political sphere, though in ways far less obvious than kings, ministers, or generals. Some acted as silent stateswomen, maneuvering behind curtains and through family ties, while others broke through expectations and became rebels whose defiance altered dynasties. The lives of these women remind us that authority often moves in subtle ways. They show that a sister's whisper could shift the direction of a kingdom just as surely as a brother's command. The Tudor sisters in England provide one of the clearest windows into this dynamic. Elizabeth, who would later become Elizabeth I, is remembered as a monarch who ruled with unmatched intelligence and resilience. But before she ascended the throne, her older half-sister Mary exerted influence that reveals the complexity of sisterhood in politics. Mary, later known as Mary I, initially wielded her position as the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon to secure respect for her legitimacy. Even when declared illegitimate during her father's turbulent marriages, she drew upon networks of loyalty to rally support. Her presence in court, even before she was crowned, shaped policy. By virtue of her birth and her alliances, she became a figure others rallied around, a potential center of resistance or obedience depending on the situation. Elizabeth, in turn, learned from these years of watching Mary. She saw how loyalty was built, how suspicion could destroy trust, and how personal charisma could translate into political leverage. When Elizabeth finally became queen, she carried with her the lessons of living in the shadow of her sister's power. Mary's reign itself shows the ambivalence of a sister's authority. As queen, she acted with determination to restore Catholicism in England, yet her methods alienated many. Her marriage to Philip of Spain tied England to the Habsburgs, a move that sparked unease and resentment. Elizabeth, kept under watch during these years, became both a threat and a bargaining chip. Their rivalry, born of blood and belief, illustrates how sisters could be bound by intimacy yet divided by politics, and how that division could define the fate of a nation. Without Mary's reign, Elizabeth's later settlement and long rule would have been different. For Elizabeth's cautious balancing of religion and politics was forged in the crucible of her sister's failures and successes. In this way, Mary was both Elizabeth's rival and her teacher. This pattern of sisters acting as silent stateswomen extends far beyond the Tudors. Across Europe and Asia, sisters often shaped policies not by sitting on thrones, but by guiding brothers, nephews, or even husbands. Their power lay in access, in the trust they commanded, and in their ability to speak freely in spaces where ministers had to tread carefully. Letters reveal how sisters often counseled moderation when rulers leaned toward aggression, or encouraged boldness when hesitation threatened to weaken authority. Because they were family, their words carried a weight that formal advisors lacked. A king could dismiss a minister without remorse, but the advice of a sister lingered, tied to bonds of childhood and shared blood. In this sense, sisters acted as shadow counselors, their influence woven into decisions that later appeared in official chronicles with no trace of their presence. In the Valois dynasty of France, for example, the sisters of kings were deeply involved in court intrigues. Marguerite of Valois, famously remembered as Queen Margot, was married into the Bourbon family as part of an attempt to reconcile Catholics and Protestants. Her personal charisma, intelligence, and ability to navigate treacherous court politics made her a key figure during the religious wars that tore France apart. Though often dismissed as scandalous by her enemies, Marguerite's memoirs reveal a woman acutely aware of power and determined to survive within it. Her marriage was intended as a bridge between factions, but her personal maneuvering kept her relevant even when her political role faltered. She embodied the paradox of the silent stateswoman and the rebel, constrained by the roles assigned to her, yet always testing the limits, reshaping the boundaries of what a royal sister could be. In Spain, the infantas often acted as mediators in political disputes, using their status as sisters to kings to temper conflict or strengthen alliances. They corresponded with foreign courts, delivered advice, and sometimes served as unofficial ambassadors. Because they were seen as less threatening than male relatives, their words could travel with less suspicion, even when they carried significant political weight. These sisters reveal how power can function not through overt displays, but through subtler channels of influence. In the Mughal Empire, once again, we see sisters playing roles that blurred the lines between silence and rebellion. Jahanara Begum, the sister of Emperor Aurangzeb, became deeply involved in the succession struggle that determined the fate of the empire in the 17th century. While her sister Jahanara often counseled peace and worked as a mediator, Jahanara chose the opposite path. She aligned herself with Aurangzeb and helped him seize the throne, even betraying their own father, Shah Jahan, who had built the Taj Mahal. Her choice was bold, ruthless, and deeply rebellious, for it overturned the expected role of a daughter and sister. Yet it also demonstrates the political agency sisters could wield when they decided to act. Jahanara was not content with passive loyalty. She inserted herself into the highest stakes of imperial politics, and her decisions altered the course of the Mughal dynasty. In her story, we see how a sister could be both silent and radical, advising, betraying, and ultimately reshaping history. Even in courts where women were tightly controlled, their personal charisma could transform them into silent stateswomen. Charisma itself was a political resource. A sister who could charm, persuade, and win loyalty might outmaneuver ministers who had formal authority. Salons hosted by sisters in 17th and 18th century Europe became centers of political conversation, where ideas and alliances were formed under the cover of cultural gatherings. In these spaces, women who were officially excluded from council chambers nonetheless steered discussions, influenced factions, and cultivated loyalties. They blurred the line between cultural patronage and political maneuvering, turning social gatherings into arenas of statecraft. At times, sisters stepped beyond silence and into outright rebellion. They resisted marriages arranged for them, challenged dynastic plans, or even raised armies. Their rebellions might fail, but they signaled the limits of patriarchal control. In Sweden, Princess Cecilia Vasa in the 16th century repeatedly defied her brothers, engaging in scandals that had political consequences, and showing that sisters could disrupt as well as sustain dynastic order. In Russia, Sophia Alekseyevna went even further, seizing power as regent during her brother's minority in the late 17th century. Though not formally crowned, she ruled with authority, used the Streltsy Guard to secure her power, and demonstrated that a sister could be not just a behind-the-scenes counselor, but a ruler in practice. Her eventual downfall does not erase the fact that for several years she embodied the possibility of female power in a context that had little room for it. Sophia's rebellion against the limits imposed on her gender was both personal and political, making her one of the most striking examples of a royal sister who turned silent statesmanship into open rule. The thread uniting all these stories is the way sisters adapted to the boundaries placed around them. Some accepted those boundaries and worked within them, wielding influence quietly. Others tested them, bending rules and pushing against expectations until they carved out space for themselves. And a few broke them altogether, rebelling in ways that shook dynasties. Whether silent counselors or defiant rebels, they were always present, shaping the currents of politics in ways that deserve recognition. Their impact may not always be recorded in proclamations or treaties, but it lingers in the directions nations took, the compromises rulers made, and the upheavals that redrew histories. When we step back and look at the stories of Mary and Elizabeth in England, Marguerite of Valois in France, Jahanara and Jahanara in India, and Sophia Alekseyevna in Russia, we see that royal sisters occupied a spectrum of political roles far wider than history has often admitted. They could be protectors of dynasties, counselors of kings, saboteurs of plans, or even rulers in disguise. What makes their stories so compelling is not only the range of their actions, but also the awareness they had of their own positions. They understood that to be a sister was both a limitation and an opportunity. It meant exclusion from formal power, but it also meant intimacy with those who held it. In that space of intimacy, they found room to act, to persuade, and sometimes to defy. The lesson they offer us is that politics is not only made in council chambers and battlefields. It is also made in the quiet conversations between siblings, in the confidences shared at night, in the loyalties of childhood carried into adulthood. Sisters, by virtue of their closeness to rulers, were uniquely positioned to shape those intimate spaces where great decisions were born. Whether silent stateswomen or daring rebels, they show us that history's margins are often where its most enduring forces reside. The stories of sisters who acted as silent stateswomen, or as overt rebels, naturally lead us into the even sharper edge of defiance, where women did not simply maneuver within boundaries, but crossed them outright. These sisters rejected the roles assigned to them, either subtly through quiet influence or dramatically through rebellion, and in doing so they left behind consequences that reached far beyond their personal lives. Their acts often shocked their families, disturbed courts, and shifted the course of governance or succession. They remind us that the power of refusal, resistance, or self-determined ambition can carry as much weight as loyalty or obedience. When royal sisters chose to act against expectation, they sometimes altered dynasties entirely. The Tudor dynasty again provides a telling starting point. Elizabeth and Mary shaped England in different ways, but their younger half-sister, also named Mary, better known as Mary Tudor, the French queen, was another example of rebellion within limits. She defied the will of her brother Henry VIII when, after her brief marriage to the elderly French King Louis XII ended with his death, she secretly married Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, without the king's consent. Such an act was both scandalous and dangerous, for royal sisters were expected to marry only when and how political strategy dictated. By marrying for love, Mary asserted her personal will against dynastic calculation. Henry was furious, but the marriage ultimately held, and though it caused political turbulence, it also revealed that royal sisters could resist being treated purely as pawns. Mary's rebellion did not end a dynasty, but it changed her own life and demonstrated that even in the 16th century, when royal marriages were central to governance, a sister could carve out space for her desires. The precedent of her choice echoed into later debates about the limits of control over royal women. In other contexts, sisters did more than marry against orders. They directly influenced who would sit on the throne. In Russia, Sophia Alekseyevna's regency after the death of her brother, Tsar Feofor III, shows how a sister's defiance could reshape governance itself. When her younger brothers Ivan and Peter, the future Peter the Great, were declared joint rulers, Sophia positioned herself as regent, arguing that the boys were too young to govern. Supported by the Streltsy Guard, she took control of the state in her own name. Though she never wore the crown officially, for 7 years she ruled Russia, directing policy, corresponding with foreign courts, and managing the intricate politics of the Kremlin. Her governance was far from silent influence. It was open rebellion against the assumption that only men could govern. Even when Peter later deposed her, placing her in a convent, the memory of Sophia's rule lingered as proof that a sister could wield direct authority over a vast empire. Her story highlights how personal ambition, fused with charisma and political calculation, could overturn expectations and force an entire state to reckon with female power. A similar thread runs through the Mughal dynasty in India, where succession disputes were often violent and sisters played crucial roles. Jahanara Begum, as already noted, betrayed her father Shah Jahan to aid her brother Aurangzeb in seizing the throne. Her defiance of filial duty and sisterly loyalty reshaped the empire's history. By choosing to side with Aurangzeb, she helped him become emperor, and her support gave his claim legitimacy at a critical moment. Jahanara's rebellion was personal, but also profoundly political, for it determined which brother would rule and what kind of empire the Mughals would become. In contrast, her sister Jahanara Begum, who supported their father, embodied another kind of defiance, resisting the new emperor and attempting to keep alive her father's authority. Both sisters acted outside the expected roles of dutiful daughters. One became a kingmaker, the other a loyalist rebel. Their influence on succession was so direct that without their actions, the outcome of the struggle might have been entirely different. The Mughal sisters remind us that rebellion could take many forms, from betrayal to loyalty, but in both cases it was decisive. France in the 16th century provides another vivid stage, where sisters shaped governance through rebellion. Marguerite of Valois, whose marriage to Henry of Navarre was intended to unite Catholics and Protestants, lived a life marked by defiance. Her refusal to submit quietly to her family's manipulations, her political maneuvering during the wars of religion, and her eventual estrangement from both her husband and her brothers made her a controversial figure. Yet her actions helped preserve the Bourbon line that would eventually inherit the French crown. Her personal choices, though scandalous in the eyes of contemporaries, had dynastic consequences, ensuring that France would survive its brutal wars of faith. By asserting her independence, Marguerite shaped not only her own fate, but the fate of French monarchy itself. Her memoirs later revealed a sharp political mind, one that used rebellion as a tool of survival, and as a means of influencing the course of history. Not all rebellions were so dramatic. Some sisters shaped governance through quiet but steady influence, resisting not by open defiance but by subtle persuasion. In Austria, Archduchess Maria Anna, sister of Maria Theresa, was deeply involved in intellectual and scientific pursuits. While she did not lead armies or instigate revolts, she used her patronage of science and philosophy to shape the intellectual climate of the Habsburg court. By insisting on her own interests and refusing to be confined solely to religious devotion or passive roles, she shifted the cultural balance of the dynasty. Her example shows how defiance could be quieter but no less significant. In resisting the limits placed on her, she influenced how knowledge was pursued and preserved, which in turn affected how her family governed. Succession itself was often a stage where sisters could rebel. By refusing to accept the sidelining of their own rights, they challenged dynastic norms. In Scotland, Mary Stuart's half-sister, the Countess of Moray, played a decisive part in the conflicts around Mary's reign. Through alliances, correspondence, and opposition, she shaped the balance of power. Her influence contributed to the struggles over succession that defined Scotland in the 16th century. Similarly, in Spain, the infantas sometimes asserted their claims in ways that unsettled their brother's authority. These were not full-scale rebellions, but they were persistent challenges that forced rulers to adapt. The act of questioning succession or resisting exclusion was itself a form of rebellion that altered governance. It is striking how often sisters chose rebellion not out of ambition for power alone but out of conviction, loyalty, or survival. Mary Tudor's decision to marry Charles Brandon was driven by love. Sophia Alekseyevna's regency was born out of the conviction that she could govern better than male relatives. Jahanara Begum sided with Aurangzeb out of both calculation and the promise of survival in a brutal succession war. Marguerite of Valois resisted because her conscience and circumstances left her no alternative. These acts of rebellion, personal though they were, became political because of the roles these women occupied. Their very position as sisters meant that their choices, however private, had public consequences. In this way, rebellion by sisters often blurred the line between the personal and the political, reminding us that in royal families, the two could never be separated. What these examples share is the courage to step outside roles that were rigidly defined. In societies where women were expected to be obedient, deferential, and silent, royal sisters who acted otherwise disrupted the entire structure of power. Their rebellions could destabilize dynasties, alter successions, and influence governance for years to come. They reveal that defiance was itself a form of political action, one that carried risks but also produced legacies. Some were remembered as villains, others as heroines, but all left marks that cannot be ignored. The broader lesson is that history is not only shaped by compliance, but by resistance. The sisters who defied societal norms or family expectations demonstrate that power is often reshaped by those who refuse to accept it as it is. Their stories deepen our understanding of monarchy, showing it not as a rigid institution, but as a dynamic one constantly tested by the wills of individuals. In the defiance of royal sisters, we see the possibilities and perils of rebellion. We see how personal choices can ripple outward into dynastic struggles, wars, and reforms. And we see that even in the most constrained lives, agency could break through, altering the course of history in ways no one could predict. The stories of rebellion and influence, of sisters who stepped outside the roles designed for them, would be incomplete without reflecting on what their lives mean for us today. These women were not isolated figures caught only in their own time. Their choices and defiance echo forward, shaping both the societies they lived in and the ways we now think about women, power, and history. Though centuries have passed, the impact of their lives is still felt, even when their names are forgotten or hidden in footnotes. Their enduring echoes remind us that history is not a static tale of kings and wars, but a living legacy that influences culture, governance, and identity long after the players themselves have gone. One of the most direct echoes is visible in the way dynasties unfolded. Consider again Mary Tudor's choice to marry Charles Brandon against her brother Henry VIII's wishes. That act, personal though it was, forced the English monarchy to negotiate the line between absolute authority and individual will. It may seem minor compared to the grand battles of the Tudor age, but it planted the idea that even those tied to the throne could resist its demands. Over time, the notion that royal women might claim some space for personal choice contributed to the gradual softening of rigid dynastic controls. In today's world, When modern royal marriages are often framed as personal decisions rather than diplomatic contracts, one can trace the beginnings of that change back to moments like Mary's defiance. The acceptance that a princess might marry for love rather than politics has reshaped monarchies into more relatable institutions, helping them survive in the modern age. Sophia Alekseyevna's regency in Russia left another enduring legacy. Although she was eventually deposed and confined to a convent, her rule set a precedent that women could, under certain conditions, govern an empire. This precedent mattered greatly when Peter the Great's successors faced succession crises in the 18th century. Women such as Catherine the Great could be accepted as rulers not only because of their own abilities, but also because Sophia's regency had carved a pathway, however contested, for female authority. Today, when we think of Catherine the Great as one of Russia's defining rulers, we should also remember Sophia, whose rebellion prepared the ground. Her echo lingers in the ongoing conversations about female leadership in politics, where precedent and memory shape what societies see as possible. The Mughal sisters Jahanara and Jahanara also left echoes that outlasted their immediate struggles. Jahanara's decision to support Aurangzeb ensured that his vision of an orthodox, centralized empire would dominate Indian history for decades. Her influence helped create the conditions that would eventually test the empire's ability to adapt to diversity and modern pressures. Jahanara, in contrast, championed cultural and spiritual inclusiveness, and her legacy lived on in the architecture and cultural patronage she inspired. Today, when people visit Delhi's great buildings or read about the Mughal era as a mixture of brilliance and strife, they are seeing the results of choices made by sisters whose names are often secondary in the record. Their echoes remind us that behind every emperor were women whose support or resistance determined the empire's path. In modern South Asia, where debates about identity, pluralism, and legacy remain heated, the actions of these women still reverberate. The life of Marguerite of Valois, Queen of France and later remembered through her memoirs, offers another echo into the present. Her decision to tell her own story, to set down in writing her perspective on the wars, marriages, and betrayals of her time, left a rare female voice from an age when women were expected to be silent. Her writings challenged the idea that history belonged only to men. Today, as we place greater value on memoirs, diaries, and letters as historical sources, Marguerite stands as an early example of how a woman could seize control of her own narrative. The very act of writing was itself a rebellion, and its legacy is visible in the way modern historians increasingly seek out the voices of women who were once dismissed. When we speak of representation and of broadening the scope of history to include those previously ignored, Marguerite's echo is present. Even the quieter defiance of sisters like Maria Anna of Austria carries forward into the present. Her patronage of science and intellectual pursuits reflects the importance of women in shaping cultural and scientific landscapes, even when they lacked formal power. The universities, libraries, and academies that flourished in Europe partly owed their survival to patrons who were women. Today, when debates about access to education for women continue in parts of the world, the example of royal sisters who insisted on learning and who used their resources to support it remains a powerful reminder. Their echo encourages us to see education as a field where rebellion against limitation can change societies for generations. Yet despite these lasting impacts, many of these women are absent from common narratives. We remember Henry VIII, but not always Mary Tudor's defiance. We celebrate Peter the Great, but Sophia Alekseyevna is often only a footnote. We admire the grandeur of Mughal architecture without acknowledging Jahanara's patronage. We speak of Catherine the Great as if she emerged fully formed, forgetting the precedent set by Sophia. This forgetting is not accidental. It reflects centuries of storytelling shaped by chroniclers who often dismissed or minimized women's roles. The echoes of these sisters were not erased, but they were muffled, softened to fit the narrative of male power. The question of why they have been forgotten leads us into the structure of historical memory. Traditional histories focused on wars, laws, and monarchs, domains where men were the visible actors. Women's influence, whether through marriages, counsel, rebellion, or patronage, was often behind the scenes and therefore deemed less worthy of record. When women stepped into the open, like Sophia or Marguerite, they were often criticized or vilified, painted as unnatural for seeking power. Over time, these judgments hardened into neglect. Even when their actions shaped dynasties, the official accounts preferred to emphasize the men they supported or opposed. Thus their echoes remained, but their names blurred. It is only in recent decades, as historians have turned attention to women's history, that their stories are resurfacing in fuller form. This rediscovery itself is part of their legacy. By studying these sisters, we learn not only about their lives but also about the biases that shape the telling of history. Their forgetting reveals how power chooses what to remember. By bringing them back into focus, we challenge those choices and expand the narrative. In this sense, the act of remembering them is itself a continuation of their rebellion. Just as they resisted being confined in their own time, their stories now resist being silenced in ours. Their echoes also matter because they offer modern lessons. When we see how sisters navigated power, we learn about the possibilities of resistance, adaptation, and influence. Mary Tudor's defiance suggests that even small acts of personal will can ripple into political consequences. Sophia Alekseyevna's regency demonstrates that leadership is not limited by gender, even when society insists otherwise. Jahanara's ambition and Jahanara's patronage remind us that choices rooted in conviction shape cultural and political landscapes. Marguerite's memoirs underscore the value of telling one's own story. Maria Anna's patronage highlights the importance of education and knowledge. Together, these women remind us that agency, even when constrained, can transform the world. In our time, where women hold office, lead nations, and shape global culture, it is tempting to see their presence as natural or inevitable. But these royal sisters remind us that such progress was built on centuries of resistance and persistence. Their echoes are visible in every debate about equality, in every woman who steps into leadership, and in every reconsideration of history that seeks to uncover hidden contributions. They remind us that progress is not linear, but is made of countless acts of defiance, some remembered, many forgotten. The fact that we can now celebrate them, even if belatedly, is itself a testament to the endurance of their legacy. As we ponder their forgetting, it is worth asking why their stories resonate so strongly today. Perhaps it is because their struggles feel familiar. The tension between personal desire and societal expectation, between loyalty and independence, between silence and voice, is not limited to royalty or to the past. These sisters live those tensions in extreme form, but their experiences echo in modern lives where people still face choices about conformity and resistance. Their stories are not distant curiosities but mirrors of dilemmas still faced in families, workplaces, and governments around the world.
The message their lives leave with us is both sobering and hopeful. Sobering because it shows how easily significant contributions can be overlooked or erased and how fragile recognition can be. Hopeful because their echoes prove that even when forgotten, the impact of their action endures. Families shifted, culture blossomed, ideas spread, and models were set because sisters dared to resist. Their names may fade, but their influence remains woven into the structure we still live with. Remembering them is more than an act of justice to the past. It is also an act of inspiration for the present. Their courage, in whatever form it took, offered models of resilience and agency. By telling their stories, we remind ourselves that history belongs not only to the powerful but to the determined, not only to kings but to sisters. The endurance of the echoes encourages us to listen more carefully to voices that might otherwise be dismissed, seek out the hidden heroines in our own communities, and to recognize that influence often works in delicate, persistent ways. Share the stories of unsung heroines you know, whether from history, from your own culture, or from your own family. Each story adds to the response that ensures these echoes do not fade. By speaking their names, by telling their tales, we strengthen their legacies of those who resisted silence. Just as the sisters we have explored shaped families, art, science, and governance, so too can the stories we remember today shape how future generations understand the past and visualize the future. Their enduring echoes are not only reminder of what was, but guides for us what can be if we choose to listen.